So growing up, my parents they owned a home, and we were grew up in there in Oklahoma, but it was during the 1980s, actually the late 1980s. I don't know if you remember, but we had the economy hit a road bump. We ran into a recession, and so my dad lost his job. And thinking back on that, I'm not sure how long he was actually unemployed before the decision was made. We need to do something, or they need to do something for our family. And so I do remember though, it was they decided that we are moving to Florida. We had a little bit of family down there, and it was going to be a fresh start because I guess the economy was doing better. I was so young that I remember my world, but it was such a smaller picture compared to what they were going through. And so the decisions they had to make to pick up our family from our lives in Oklahoma and move them across the country, right? To essentially start over again. And so, but I do remember our time in Florida, and I remember driving down there. It wasn't just my family that went. It was like my parents took their four kids, and then we had, I want to say it was like 3 or 4 cars. It was almost like a caravan. Plus, we were pulling trailers because we loaded everything up and just went hauling across country. And by the time we got to Florida, it was like my family and 3 cousins, like 3 adult cousins that moved down there with us. And it's crazy because you start building, like if you're an adult and you move across country, you kind of start building roots in that area and developing your life in that area. And so as a kid, I go down there and I left all my friends behind in Oklahoma, and we had to start over. And the whole time we were in Florida, I think it was like 5 or 6 years we lived down there. We rented the whole time. And honest to God, it seemed like we moved houses every year. I mean, it was probably an exaggeration, but I think we moved like 4 or 5 times when we were down there. And sometimes we would move back to the same, we would move and change schools or school districts. And sometimes we moved back to that school district a year or so later. And it was just, and I look back now and being in this industry, I get it, I understand. You do what you can do to survive and look out for your kids, right? And I'm assuming that the recession that hit in the 1980s really damaged my parents financially and credit-wise, and so they couldn't purchase a house, or maybe the houses were too expensive in Florida. But that was a key part growing up, because I know I wasn't happy, right? I mean, going from here to there, I never had friends. We were never able to put down roots. I didn't join the sports. I mean, our church kind of stayed the same, but that was it. We never really lived near anyone. And so every year it was almost like you're starting over again. And then I remember it was, I want to say it was 1992, we moved back to Oklahoma. My parents had been working at the University of Florida for years, and they got enough going, but the decision was made. They still owned their house in Oklahoma, and they're renting it out. And so the decision was made, hey, we're going to move back to Oklahoma, we're going to move back into our house, and we're going to reestablish ourselves. And so we did that, right? And it's crazy going from the 3rd grade to the 8th grade and seeing everyone that you left. But it's almost like you just pick right back up, because that's the roots that you have. That's where we were established. That's where I remembered, right? And I started enjoying going back to school, because this is my area. This is my familiarization. And I had like the best high school years going in there. I got on the football team. I went and got a part-time job. I remember we would show up a kid's house and we'd make floats for the parades, right? And it was just different stuff like that. We didn't have that in Florida. In Florida, it was like we didn't belong. We were constantly moving around. And that's one thing that when I became an adult, I didn't want that for my kids. I wanted my kids to have a solid foundation, which is hard because, we joined the military right away. And so we all know what happens in the military. Every 3 years, you're moving somewhere. But once we left the military, one of my main objectives was I wanted to buy a house. I wanted to settle down and set the roots. And my kids have that now, right? We have our house, we have our roots. They ride the school bus with all their friends. And I loved seeing that because every morning I stand out there with my wife and I just look, I go, man, look at these kids. They're sitting there waiting for the bus, laughing and joking, right? And then we see, that's the younger kids, and we see the older kids come up and they're a little bit more cool. And so they have to separate into their groups. I'm like, it's so weird watching development happen in your neighborhoods, right? But everyone's happy. We all get along. We love our neighbors. So that's what it means to me to own a home. It builds your community together and allows you to settle down roots, right? Establish yourself.